right, hello. So good to see so many of you here today. My name is Rhys and I'm quite alien to this space, I think. It's not something that I would normally be speaking at, and it's been a kind of interesting experience so far, listening to the talks, getting to know everyone, thinking about how what I would normally do might speak to what you're doing here at Ethereum. So what I normally do is I work on sustainable and just futures, but I do it from the perspective of narrative and poetics, aesthetics, and politics. So what I mean by that is I think about how we tell stories, I think about the language that we use and the form of the narratives, I think about how we represent them, what they look like, and then the politics comes in because all of that stuff frames the world in a certain way. They say, the world is this way, humans are like this, nature is like this, and the relationships between those things are in this particular kind of way. So they say how things are, and they make claims about how things could be, right? Now, the world is just kind of out there, and the future doesn't exist yet. Neither of them are meaningful in any real sense. It's us that brings meaning to them and to our actions through narrative, poetics, and aesthetics, right? These things are meaning-making machines, if you want to think of them that way. And the kind of meanings that we make are where the politics of all of these stories live. So I want to talk about Solarpunk in these terms. So what does Solarpunk mean to the Ethereum community? You're busy building the future, okay? But what kind of future are you building? I get the sense that you're looking for, I read somewhere, someone calling it a kind of Schelling point, right? Something for you all to gravitate towards, aim for. And I get the impression that Solarpunk is a kind of plug-and-play goal or vision for the Ethereum community. It seems to sit well with Ethereum. And there's a number of kind of overlaps that I've noticed in the way that Solarpunk talks about itself and the way that Ethereum communities talk about themselves, right? There's a sense in which they both provide hope and agency, which is something that we all need in today's kind of permanent crisis world, right? We need to feel like we can do something that will make a difference, and we need to feel that sense of agency. They also share an interest in transparency, and I think that's kind of fascinating, right? And I'll come back to that in more detail later. They also are interested in coordinating collectively, rather than as kind of selfish, rational individuals, right? The neoliberal model. And in Ethereum, this comes out in things like DAOs and smart contracts and the ethos of decentralization. And then finally, there is a hope, I think, this kind of sustainable future vision hope, where technology and the environment can be integrated and harmonious rather than separated and antagonistic, right? So these are the kind of overlaps, I think. Now, I suspect, as I said, that the heart of Solarpunk's resonance for the Ethereum community lies in this idea of transparency. Really briefly, in both of them, Solarpunk and Ethereum, the hope is for a kind of transparent and harmonious future. They both define their agency as having the means to build that future. The collective coordination that we're talked about is facilitated by that transparency, the making harmonious or transparent of human power relations. And the relationships between technology and nature in these futures essentially disappear because they become harmonious, right? They become clarified, transparent, they almost cease to exist. And what are smart contracts and DAOs and other kind of Ethereum attempts to resolve coordination problems, if not attempts to make relations transparent, free from distortion or manipulation, free from power, in a sense, free from politics? And instead of messy political relationships, you can just have clean and clear, algorithmic, stable, functioning transactions. So, Solarpunk seems to map well onto what Ethereum wants to do, right? But what is Solarpunk? It's not a blueprint. It's not a plan. It's not a kind of clear aim where you can just sort of solve for it, right? It's a genre. It's a set of narratives, a set of aesthetics, and it carries a kind of emotional charge through the kind of world building that it does, right? Through the worlds that it posits and the worlds that it imagines. And as I said, narratives and aesthetics are powerful things. They govern how we see the world and ourselves, and they give meaning to it all. So they shape what we think is normal, possible, valuable, but they also make some things disappear completely, right? They make us notice some things, they bring some things to the foreground, and then they push other things to the background. So solarpunk aesthetics, in the same vein, make certain things like harmony between nature and technology or transparency in human relations seem possible. In this sense, solarpunk is a promising genre. A sociologist might call it a promissory narrative, right? It rises to the moment of crisis, it answers a need that we have, and it binds its promises to technological changes, particular kinds of technological changes, right? It paints a beautiful picture of a world that will come about only if we adopt certain ways of being and certain technologies. Now, it's not an advertising vehicle, it's not a PR front, but it can be used as one. It sees technological change as a driver for bringing about its utopian futures, okay? And that's really key. So, solarpunk is a promising genre. How does it promise? How does it make its promises to us? Firstly, the way it looks, okay? Aesthetics, the way it looks. Now, it exists on a spectrum from tiny hobbit houses, right, all the way to like shiny, kind of futuristic techno cities. But in all of them, across the whole spectrum, there's loads of greenery front and center. This is a very basic point, right? There's lots and lots of nature in solarpunk, whether it's a super urbanized version or more of a kind of cottagey version, right? There's tons of greenery. Now, the critic Frederick Jameson would call this an imaginary resolution to a real contradiction. And I want you to remember that phrase. It's important, okay? An imaginary resolution to a real contradiction. What that means is that it brings together two things in the imagination that in reality do not coexist harmoniously. On the one hand, urban settings, human settlements at scale, the various infrastructures of extraction, production, distribution, and so on that make that human life possible, that make it what it is, that materialize it in the world. And on the other hand, natural ecosystems. Solarpunk just kind of jams these together aesthetically in the way that it looks, right? And it presents us with this imaginary resolution of them coexisting side by side and harmoniously, when in fact they are, contradictory in real life. The next way it makes its promises is through lightness. Now, there's a tradition in aesthetic philosophy of thinking through this idea of luster. Now, luster is a nice word for glow or light or shining or reflection, okay? Usually it's either reflected light or some kind of sense of an inner light, right? Inner beauty. Now, examples from sort of medieval philosophy onwards, this is the beauty of the untarnished soul, of the blinding goodness of Christ, of morality, of the saints, the blinding light of God, the illumination of the light of reason, the enlightenment, right? This is a kind of trope with a very long history. And solarpunk aesthetics is all about luster. It's all about glowing, shining, bright things. Solar advertising, by the same kind of remit, and renewable futures in general, are full of gleaming, brilliant sunshine and light. Again, this is like a basic point, right? But beyond just looking nice, this does something quite specific. It unifies. Think of the sun shining over a gleaming city. This gleam binds together all the different things it shines on, and it suggests harmony, where there is in fact lots of different, often conflicting elements and systems. Snow has a similar effect, right? Dazzling, hiding, uniting, purifying, covering over all the garbage and complications that you have in a normal city, so that when you wake up on that kind of fresh snow morning, what you see is harmony and beauty and unity. The reflection rather than the thing itself, right? The stuff that it's covering. And this sense of lightness, as in brightness, slips into another kind of lightness, which is to say weightlessness. Solarpunk casts into relief the quality of weightlessness, with which renewable futures and solar power in particular is associated. Images of solar futures from any source, corporate to activist, tend to display solar technologies in a bright, clean, green setting. Now, there's obvious pragmatic reasons for this, right? The main one being that like a gloomy solar future wouldn't be particularly persuasive or seductive, okay? If anyone's seen Blade Runner 2049, the kind of opening shot of the like masses of solar-powered fields under the gloom, it's dystopian and horrible and so on. But these Solarpunk images are suggestive of a kind of new dawn, right? Of a new spring, of fresh beginnings, and they're attractive. And part of that attraction is tied to the idea of weightlessness, because they offer us the chance to forget what came before, to absolve ourselves of our own environmentally damaging history, or at least to cut ourselves off from it, right? To have this new, fresh start. So lightness is a kind of weightlessness that comes with absolution and freedom from responsibility, freedom from having to deal with the complex reality of the present and all its historical burdens and realities. And we can see the links here, I hope, to the kind of ideas of transparency that both Solarpunk and Ethereum dream of, right? It's a hope, ultimately, of a clean break with the past and the present, and of just getting rid of all the messiness of social and power relationships that are the direct and necessary product of having to mediate between difference. Now, yesterday, I was speaking to someone from the kind of Ethereum community, and they were wonderful. They were full of hope, full of kind of happiness, and the key dream, I think, that drove their engagement with the Ethereum community was this sense that everything is broken and we're going to build something to replace it, something that works, right? And that everything is so big, isn't it? It's everything. It's like all the systems that govern the way that we live, they're all broken, and here we're going to be building something that replaces it. And, again, I'm coming back to this idea, this hope that I think infuses Solarpunk and Ethereum of transparency, right? Getting rid of all that messiness and all that power relationship and just having this direct and necessary kind of simple relationship between things, a kind of getting rid of mediation. Now, this lightness is also a Trojan horse for technologies that claim to be socially just or sustainable, presenting themselves as light, right? Light in the sense of goodness and beauty, but also light in the sense of weightless, of leaving no footprint on the earth. Now, solar is the ultimate light technology here, and I would just kind of expand on this as an example, but it applies to renewable technologies in general. It has this image of having no connection to the earth, right? No consequences, no waste, no fuel, no weight, ultimately. But that obviously isn't the reality, right? Solar production, upstream, it has to be made. And it's made in incredibly intensive temperatures. It's made in sterile lab-like conditions, large-scale factories, toxic chemicals. There's extraction, there's production, there's rare earth minerals. There's all of the ugly geopolitics that goes with that. There's the fact that solar panels are currently so excitingly cheap because the vast majority of them are made in China, where there's very poor environmental and labor regulation laws. Right? There's all of these issues with solar panels upstream. Then there are the kind of sacrifice zones that will be produced by them. So we're talking about a kind of neo-colonialism here, where large-scale areas of various deserts will, be covered in solar panels. And then the question becomes, who does the energy go to, right? And there's already talk of large swathes of North Africa becoming a battery for Europe, right? And you can see these old historical patterns repeating themselves just under the guise of a new, clean kind of technology, right? Sustainability as a kind of cover for colonialism. And then downstream, solar panel PVs, they have around a 30-year lifespan. A lot of them are going to start coming offline quite soon. They're very hard to recycle. They're toxic. So, to repeat the key point here, the conflicts, the politics in the relationships between humans and the natural world and between humans and each other only appear to be dissolved in these visions of solarpunk futures, in these visions of renewable futures. They're not resolved. They just take on a different shape. So, how does Solarpunk promise? Again, one more thing. the narratives themselves. They promise to resolve conflict between two opposing forces. You can see, right? It's always about resolving conflict. Narratively, what they do is you have, in a Solarpunk story, quite often you have two opposing sides, right? And what happens is that the conflict between those two opposing forces is resolved by the production in the story of a protagonist, a character, a hero. And that hero is a hybrid of the two sides, okay? So the hero, the hybrid that partakes of both sides of the conflict in some way, they act as a mediator, right? They bring them together and they solve the conflict. They are, in their kind of body, a resolution to that conflict, right? And just like lightness, just like weightlessness, these protagonists are an imaginary resolution of a real contradiction. Yeah? Just bringing them together and making them the same thing without having to actually find a way to mediate between these two conflicting sides in all their real complexity. Instead of working out the necessary political means, we just get rid of it. Yeah? We just make it disappear. And here again, there's this idea of doing away with the need to mediate between different actors, whether those actors are industry and nature, or different communities, or different political organizations, or just people with different desires and hopes. Whatever. We always return to this idea of transparency. It's a dream. It's a dream of living without friction or confusion. It's a dream of perfect communication. It's a dream of message with no noise, right? It's a dream of perfectly functioning systems, smoothness, lack of friction, lack of resistance. In my terms, I would say that it's the removal of politics in favor of a technocracy, solving political problems with technological solutions, right? But they're not solutions. They're power grabs. They strip the people involved in this particular situation, in any particular situation, of their engagement with and power over the very processes of how they live their lives, right? It removes their political agency rather than granting them political agency. And it does the same thing in terms of how it approaches the natural world, okay? So transparency in Solarpunk in terms of nature and technology is not about living with the natural world, but rather a dream of perfectly managing that world. Now, this idea has a history, and some of you might be familiar with it, right? We can call it, for brevity's sake, the history of Spaceship Earth. In the 1960s and 70s, many thinkers, perhaps the most famous of them being Buckminster Fuller, used the spaceship to offer a blueprint of a self-contained and self-sustained earthly environment. It was a whole thing that grew out of the kind of 60s sort of hippie counterculture movement, but also married to that cybernetics moment, right, of Norbert Wiener and the growth of kind of personal computing and so on. And what they proposed was a circulatory, natural, technological system, largely autonomous, to be run, maintained, and optimized through techno-scientific expertise and rational management. Notice the complete lack or absence of politics in this picture, right? Experts managing stuff. There's no dispute, there's no disagreement, there's no debate. As Richard Brautigan, the famous kind of poet from this era, put it in 1967, and you might recognize the final line of this from an Adam Curtis documentary. I like to think it has to be of a cybernetic ecology, where we are free of our labors and joined back to nature, returned to our mammal brothers and sisters, and all watched over by machines of loving grace. A cybernetic ecology. This is a precedent of Solarpunk. It's an ecological narrative imaginary, sustained by early personal computing pioneers, people like Stuart Brand of the Whole Earth Catalogue and now the Long Now Foundation. It's a movement that would certainly be considered the precedent of Web3 and its communities, and not just because of the computing stuff or the making the world a better place stuff, but also the harmony with nature stuff as well, right? It's got history. Web3 adopting Solarpunk as its dream, as its ideal, as its kind of guiding narrative, is a sort of return in that sense, where digital technology is again being married to a utopian ideal of ecological balance and community. But then, and now, the idea of doing away with mediation is imaginary, right? And this is the imaginary of Solarpunk. And potentially, some of Ethereum's vision too, right? And that's kind of what I want to flag today. There is difference in the world, and things rub up against each other and cause friction. To present them as harmonious requires not looking too closely at how those systems interact. Or it requires replacing the logic of one of those elements with the logic of the other one, which is known as colonization, right? So Solarpunk, usurping the natural and political systems through technological kind of innovation, swapping out the systems that we rely on, like the ecological natural systems that we rely on for water, food, air, and so on, swapping those out for infrastructural systems, making technology the ground for nature. And we manage nature in that way, and so we resolve the contradictions between the two things, because the two different things no longer exist, right? They've become one thing, and nature is the one that loses in that sense, the one which is usurped, right? Or which is now having to depend upon a kind of more fundamental layer, which is infrastructural or technological. Notice in the Solarpunk images that you always see, the cities have the trees growing on them, right? The cities have the trees growing on them. So, these technological, utopian narratives, these hopes and dreams, they have a long history. Longer even than the 70s cybernetic ecology moment. So in the 1970s, James Carey and John Quirk, two kind of academics, they made this beautiful argument, right? Where essentially they proposed that new technologies from the Industrial Revolution onwards were always seen as vehicles of moral as well as material progress. Things will get better materially because of the tech, but also we will get better as people, as a society, as a culture because of the tech, okay? And this promise always, always, always comes with these four particular categories, okay? A new birth of community, decentralization, ecological balance, and social harmony. Now, the first thing I would say is that the repetition, the consistency of these promises are engaging to us because we live in a particular, we being quite a narrow we in this case, right? Western kind of Enlightenment society and so on. We live in a narrow sort of history in which we have felt for a very long time that we have lost community, the capacity for decentralization, right? Things are too centralized. We've lost ecological balance and we've lost social harmony. We've been struggling with this for ages. The first known piece of written literature, the Epic of Gilgamesh, is a story 4,000 years old at this point, which talks about deforestation, right? And it talks about the collapse of order within the city. We've had these concerns since forever. And these concerns are precisely the ones which are answered by these utopian narratives. That's why the utopian narratives have such a purchase on us, because they speak to these deep, sort of almost unspoken concerns and worries that we have. But because they're technological utopian narratives, they promise to return us to this kind of Garden of Eden state, right? Where we have harmony and community and so on and so forth. But they promise it through greater investment in technology. There's a contradiction there, right? There's a contradiction there. And Solarpunk is not a new story in that sense. It's a new skin on a very old story. So notice what's at stake here. What is promised and desired is a new set of relationships. What we want is community, decentralization, ecological balance, and social harmony. We don't want the tech. We want that stuff. That's what we want, right? That's the hook. That's the promise. That's the desire. It's not about the tech, it's about the relationships. And humans, for the most part, especially urbanized humans, have felt out of sync with each other and nature for a very long time. And the utopian promise of the tech in this regard has never lived up to its claims. Every single one that Carey and Quirk talk about in their article, right? They make these promises. I mean, look where we are. It's not happened, right? So what is actually at stake here, it seems, is the social relations, not the technology. What we desire is the social relations, not the technology. The idea that the technology itself, in and of itself, will bring about these shifts, these utopian promises, is false. It's the social relations, the way that we ourselves organize, our politics, that determine the shape of the technology and the infrastructure, not the other way around. And here's the key point, okay? The betrayal of each utopian technological moment, the moment when the tech arrives and all the good stuff that was promised doesn't arrive, the betrayal comes when the technology emerges mapped onto pre-existing tendencies to centralization and domination and resource extraction and profiteering, and it acts to extend them rather than disrupt them. Narratives of promise, like Solarpunk, especially when tied to the technological novelties of things like Web3, promise us a break from our bad past and our present. And they articulate a better future, right? And it's attractive. And a lot of us are rightly seduced by it. I'm seduced by it. But let's think about that word articulate for a second, right? They articulate a better future. Articulate can mean, on the one hand, to say clearly and distinctly, I'm articulating right now. But on the other hand, articulation means to join, right? One thing articulates with another thing. To join, to joint, to bring together. Now, Solarpunk does a powerful job of talking, speaking, articulating a better future, but it does not do much to join us to one, to make that joint. When I was doing a bit of research for this talk, I found obviously other people who were talking about Ethereum and Solarpunk and so on, and I found this one talk that was very relevant. And in it, the speaker made the claim that Ethereum is Solarpunk. Ethereum is not Solarpunk, okay? Can we get rid of that idea, please? What I want us to take seriously is that Solarpunk is Ethereum. What's the difference? Okay, in the same way that Alesso's talk yesterday showed us that Solarpunk is permaculture, Ethereum is a real practice and infrastructure being built now in the present moment. It's a thing that is being brought into existence. Solarpunk futures are just empty containers. The content of any Solarpunk future will ultimately come from what Ethereum becomes, amongst other things, right? But what Ethereum becomes and makes of the world, and not the other way around. Saying that Ethereum is Solarpunk is PR. It's articulating in the sense of speaking, right? But talking about a nice future while busy being, it's talking about a nice future while being busy actually making a different future. It's the same old that we started with, right? Utopian promises of technology, but when it emerges, it will be mapped onto the same old social relations, and the same thing will happen again. Or we can take seriously the way that Ethereum is made in the present, take seriously how it makes the future in the present, how it joins the present to the future, how it brings about a particular future, how it brings it into being. Ethereum could be the substance of Solarpunk. It can be the means of joining to a Solarpunk future and giving it its content and form, right? Solarpunk is meaningless in a sense. Ethereum is the thing, however it turns out, that will give it meaning, that will tell us what it means, that will bring it into being in that sense. So my pitch today is to say, what you're doing, whether you like it or not, is deeply political. The infrastructures you build have politics coded, in this case, into their very bones. So I urge you to take that political responsibility seriously. And to do that, the focus should not be on building the tech for some harmonious, imaginary future, but on building the social relationships in the present that will shape the tech that you produce, so that its infrastructure is an infrastructure of a harmonious future, okay? Remember, technologies embody the social relations that they emerge from. They concretize them. They make them stronger and more durable, and they reproduce them. So the choice is which social relations. You have an opportunity to make a different world, but to actually do that, you have to do it from within a community that is itself an image and a seed of that better world. Who you work with, why you work, what is actually needed, allow these questions to guide you, I would suggest. You want to grow, you want to scale. So, take seriously how you scale. With whom? Who do you bring with you? What kind of relationships do you grow? What kind of politics do you make concrete through your scaling? Because there is another side to Solarpunk. Not the pretty pictures or the hopeful stories, but the communities of people who are actually living a difference right now. Many, if not most, probably don't call themselves Solarpunk, might never have heard of it, wouldn't care about it if they did. Because they don't need an imaginary future to make them feel good about what they're doing in the present. They are right now living and breathing the bones of that future. Co-ops, food sovereignty groups, microgrid communities, anti-fossil fuel activists, anti-racist groups, anti-colonial groups, local councils, all of these things, organizations who care for the world and for each other, and who are trying to build in the ruins of our current crises something more durable, something more sustainable, something more democratic. All of these people and all of these organizations need scaling. They need strengthening, and they need rolling out to the world. And if Ethereum can do that, then it should, because otherwise, what's the point? Thanks.
Any questions? Perfect.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. My question is, you were talking about getting to a Solarpunk future through technologies or maybe also other means. And what do you think about getting to a Solarpunk future with consuming less than we are actually doing now? Is it enhanced in your thoughts, or like how to actually get to this maybe economical state that won't be focused on the economic growth, but more on maybe just a stability or maybe even decrease? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Great question. So this is a tech conference, right? So I wanted to talk about the possibilities of technology and how to kind of orient it in the best possible way. But in answer to your question, I think consuming less, I think generally downgrading, I think all of these things are key. They're vital, of course they are, right? We can have as many electric cars as we want and so on. It's a culture shift that needs to happen, absolutely. My concern with technological utopianism, and I mentioned some of the leading components in the talk, is this kind of eco-modernism idea, right? Where we can have our cake and eat it. We can grow, but we can decouple that economic growth from environmental impacts. And that idea of decoupling our economic growth, which is, in this world, a direct correlative to like human happiness and well-being and so on and so forth, the idea that you can kind of decouple that from our impact on the environment, this is the weightlessness that I was talking about in Solarpunk. It's imaginary, right? You can't decouple. What you will have is a different kind of coupling. And, depending on the kinds of things that we use and the kinds of ways that they scale, those decouplings will be more or less rapacious and destructive and extractive, and there will be more or less sacrifice zones, and different kinds of communities will suffer as a result for the benefit of other kinds of communities, and all of that stuff. Yeah, absolutely. There's a whole thread of Solarpunk, which is very low tech, right? I don't know how feasible it is that the entire world will voluntarily shift to that, right? I don't see degrowth as having, absent some kind of awful crisis where everyone changes their minds, right? Because they have to. I don't see that as being a particularly appealing narrative to the people who are currently benefiting from the system. So I'm interested in what I said at the end, I suppose. I'm interested in taking the ways that I see movements like technological movements, things which currently have a lot of capital and political power flowing towards them, actors who have much greater agency than me and you, right, are like pouring resources into particular things. And I suppose I'm interested in the possibilities of reorienting those things as much as possible. It's not a solution, it's not going to like take down capitalism or whatever, but it feels like something that I can do, rather than, you know, telling everyone to just stop doing everything and hoping that they listen. Thanks.
Any more questions?
Hey. You mentioned that the hope of Solarpunk works in part as a unification for the Ethereum community. And I wonder if you also believe, or what's your take on outsiders of the community? Is it like primarily a unification for existing members, or is it also functioning as an onboarding mechanism for outsiders?
Yeah, an onboarding mechanism. Yeah, that's a nice way of putting it. I think Solarpunk is wonderful at enrolling people, or onboarding them, if you like. Yeah, I think it's a really good PR machine, to use a language that I'm not very fond of. I think that people are attracted by it, seduced by it, and I think it's, you know, 5 years ago I encountered Solarpunk, and it was at the time a small genre, some stories on the internet, and now look, right? I'm in Prague giving a talk about it. It's grown a lot. And I think more power to it for that. I think it's a great mechanism for getting people to imagine they can do something better. All I'm trying to do is point out that it's not as simple or as clear as it might seem, and that actually the work is not to work towards some imaginary harmony, because that will never happen. The work is to do something in the present which takes seriously the fact that we will always have conflict between us and each other, between nature and humans, and to try and work out the best possible way of resolving that. Because that's real work, right? That's like actual work. I like the vision as an inspiring, hopeful, agency-giving thing, but once we're in, we need to do the real work, right? Yeah.
That's all the time we have for questions.
Thank you. Thanks so much, everyone.